Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. This one's actually different because we have Angela Wagner with us, and Angela is a student at the University of the Sciences in the biomedical writing program. And Angela, you want to introduce yourself? What do you do, and what are you working on right now?
Sure. My name is Angela Wagner, and I'm actually a full-time student in the biomedical writing program at U Sciences. In the past, I have worked in the promotional space, mostly for payer, also for some clinicians, some patients. I also, have some healthcare business experience, product development, product management. I actually did OTC drug marketing for a bit, some insurance, some reimbursement, a little bit of this and that. But actually, I have worked directly with patients, for quite a while, and so I have a really great interest in what's going on with the patient. What is the patient understanding? How can the patient be educated, et cetera. So, when you approached me about this opportunity to sort of define trust between a patient and a pharmaceutical company, I was really intrigued. And so what I'm working on now is I'm actually doing a graduate level research project on the nature of the patient pharmaceutical trust construct, which has been really, really interesting. So can't wait to talk more about it.
Well, so let's start with some of the basics here, Angela. What have you discovered so far about trust? What are some things that surprised you so far?
Okay, just interesting stories, or should I create some kind of a cohesive narrative?
Pick interesting stories.
All right, so most interesting story. This is my favorite study. Researcher named Hermesh. That's his last name. I cannot remember his first name, but I know all the last names. He did a study where he actually went out and spent several months interviewing people, out in the desert, and he's interviewing government officials, and he's interviewing Bedouin in Israel, actually, was where he was, and trying to get a feel for this group, marginalized group, and how to bring them into health policy and get them to comply with health policy. And what he actually discovered was that if you take a situation where you'd normally add trust building measures, if there's already distrust, you actually will get distrust out of your trust building measures. And that was really a wake-up call for me. We generally think about trust and distrust as not being completely separate necessarily. I know there's some scholars say yes, it's a separate construct, and others say no, absolutely not. You have trust here and you have distrust here, and they are opposite ends of the same spectrum. So for him to discover that, in fact, if you add trust to distrust, you will get distrust, it was really, really interesting, and sort of blew my mind, if you will.
So why did that blow your mind?
Well, I mean, I believe that a lot of our current trust building measures are based on the assumption that if you add trust, you will get more trust.
Right.
Just sort of in general. And that did not seem to be the case here. And I think that is interesting in terms of the patient pharmaceutical company relationship, or the patient pharmaceutical industry relationship, which actually in my research I have discovered are two different things. The pharmaceutical company is more like an individual trust relationship, where the patient is one individual, the pharmaceutical company is another individual. Whereas the pharmaceutical industry is more of an institution, much like, a governmental institution. So
how are you drawing that distinction, though?
Well, I actually based that on some other research that I found that had previously been done, discussing the nature of institutional trust versus personal trust.
Okay.
And these people did, in fact, determine that a company is an individual, and incidentally, the CEO is seen as the face of the company, which is also an individual. That was an interesting one that I did not expect.
Right.
Whereas an industry is an institution, whether it's even like the oil and gas industry is an industry. Therefore, it is seen as more of an institution, which again was kind of unexpected. When I started this project, I really had no preconceptions. I started with a blank slate. I had not previously studied trust, in a scholarly way in any capacity. So it was completely new, completely fresh.
So what is the basic outline of what your paper is going to look like, and why do we frame it that way?
Okay. Well, actually, let me bring up my outline so that I can see it.
Can you share the screen?
I could share the screen. Let me bring it down to one page so we don't have to see
Okay.
a lot of stuff at once. So, share screen. Here we go. All right. Can we see it?
Not yet. Give me a second.
Okay.
Nothing yet. Did you share?
Yet. I did share the screen. Let me see my entire screen. My application window. Oh yes, let's do that. All right, here we go. It's a bit of a learning curve. Can we see it now?
We can see it now.
Okay, the outline in all of its 24-page glory. It was 23, and I've added a little bit more to it, but I'll just go through it really quickly. So basically, in this research project, I'm wanting to discuss how medical writers specifically, because of course that is my area of focus, how can they present pharmaceutical information in a way that will engender patient trust, which is something that has been...
Quick request for you. Can you actually make it bigger?
Can I make it bigger? I can make it bigger. Is it big enough?
Much better. Yep, thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so that was my general question. And I started out in the introduction kind of discussing that there is a distrust in the pharmaceutical industry. Patients actually distrust pharma more than any other industry in the United States. So they trust the government more than pharma. They trust the legal system more than pharma. And some of these, I was a little bit surprised by, but they really don't like pharma. And, some causes could be the opioid epidemic, the drug prices, and there's been evidence of that. But of course, it's not unique to the US either. And I think it's important to remember that there seems to be a worldwide systemic distrust of pharma that you can't explain by going to a single payer system where drug prices are no longer an issue. I don't want to, get into it too deeply. We'll be here for hours, but, basically the information that's been put out in terms of what should pharma do to ameliorate this issue, it doesn't necessarily help overly much. I mean, they've been trying for over a decade, maybe 2 decades now, to try and work on the pharma distrust issue, and it's not necessarily making a great difference overall. So, we've been suggesting that maybe we need to increase transparency, maybe we need to add some more touch points, maybe we need to really understand the patient journey. And as someone who has created patient journey documents for pharma, it's really, it's a very interesting process. It really is. But it may not be helping as much as we're hoping it does. So we still have distrust. We're trying to fix it. Pharma is trying to fix it. Nothing's really helping. So perhaps we need to rethink the model.
Did you see the comment on there?
Yeah.
Trust times distrust is equal to distrust. Negative times positive is still a negative, which is very true.
Very true. So it all comes down to math, unfortunately.
But here's the thing that surprised me as I saw it.
Okay.
Which is, we've always tried to solve the problem of trust by saying, we'll give you transparency, and we'll give you this, we'll give you that. And what you're really saying is that that's not going to solve the problem.
No, it actually isn't. And a little bit later, we may not, get into it today, but there was a study that was done where they were floored to discover that if you gave people more information, they did not respond with more trust.
Right.
That giving information, giving access to things, that's not necessarily what people are wanting. So, we'll go into it a little bit more.
Absolutely.
Later. So anyway, the current models, they don't necessarily deal with the complexity of the patient-pharma relationship, which is, it's not a business relationship necessarily. It's also not a consumer and, consumer business. It's not necessarily employee-employer, and it's definitely not the same as patient-physician. It's a little bit of everything, and yet it's something else altogether. So it's a pretty complex idea.
So how do you evaluate it then?
Well, actually, you start out, with nothing. You look at, in this case, We're going to look at empirical studies, so it has to use real human participant data. So, that is one of the criteria. And I'm also looking at studies that are 10 years old or less, for the most part. There may be a couple that are maybe a couple of years older, but a lot of our scholarly ideas about trust are dealing with concepts that are maybe 50 years old, maybe older. And it's not that human nature has changed that much, but it is possible that our interactions with technology are changing the way that trust is expressed. So I wanted to start from scratch with something 10 years old or less and just see what we found. So I actually went to business studies, and I did, patient studies and employer studies, because I felt like it could be any of these. It could be none of these.
Right.
So a little bit of everything. Nothing is really off limits as long as it is, coming from a peer-reviewed journal and it meets the other criteria. So a lot of interesting things from a lot of different areas of study that kind of came into it. If obviously we've got some basic assumptions, talked about some of those. Distrust is not the opposite of trust in this model. Trust is transactional. So it's not something that either exists or doesn't exist. It's something that, you get a little bit and then you do some more interaction and you may get more. So that is different from some models that are either you trust or you don't trust. Well, maybe you trust a little. Maybe you need a little more trust. Let's see, other points. Different components of trust can be satisfied by a patient perception. So the patient, actually kind of sees a reflection of what they want to see initially, and later on, it becomes more about the business and what the business can give them, or in this case, pharma. What can pharma give them?
Right.
We also, in this model, discuss written materials and the need for trust in written materials. And actually, I just finished writing in the manuscript about how, we've shown that trust can be given based on website design, based on content. So it does not require necessarily an interaction with another person in order to get trust. And that, of course, is not something that would have been an issue 50 years ago. So definitely interesting new stuff here. There are two types of trust objects. You've got institutional trust and interpersonal trust, and we discussed that a little bit.
No, we talked about it, but let's explore that a little bit more.
Okay.
It's worth sort of delving in a bit deeper.
Okay.
We said pharma, government, the internet. Essentially, it feels almost like faceless would be what is institutional.
Yeah, I would say that probably is true, because one would refer to an institution as being a thing. A thing with, we understand kind of what it is, but we may not understand completely, and it doesn't seem to have any distinct characteristics. It's not a specific entity. It doesn't have a human face, if you will.
Right.
Whereas, yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please continue.
But in terms of interpersonal trust objects, we have individuals and specific companies, and actually the CEOs of specific companies, and all of those, from the patient standpoint, are interpersonal. They are a person. They are perceived as something that has its own set of characteristics that are distinct. And that was really interesting. So I actually went out and asked people, not in the context of this study, because this study did not require IRB approval. So, okay. But I asked in general, just to get a feel for it as I was putting the outline together, do you think that the CEO of a drug company is the same as the drug company? And actually they said yes. Like overwhelmingly, people off the street were like, oh, absolutely. So that's interesting in terms of what does the behavior of a CEO say about the company? And I'd love to go further and see what does the behavior of a random person who works for the company, how does that reflect the company? Does somebody who works in regulatory, are they the company? Are they the face of the company? We don't really know, but it would be an interesting construct to see if, does this person who works at a lower level function, are they still the company? Or are they different? Is it only people in leadership that really can affect the company? So that's an interesting concept, and I'd love to delve into it more.
More variable than even that. Is it the person you know who works in that industry represents that industry.
That is a good point. And personally, not necessarily in the context of this study, but personally, I would say yes, based on not this industry necessarily, but say oil and gas, which is something,
Right.
that I have people who work there, because Houston, a lot of oil and gas here.
Okay.
And it is, you look to see what is that person doing and is that representative? Or at a hospital, what does this hospital employee do? Is this representative of the company? And certainly, I don't really want to get too much into, politics or current events here, but there's a person who works for the police department here in Houston who is, found to have been at the Capitol, and it's reflecting on the entire police department, I think. And again,
Right.
people are like, well, this person works there, they must be representative, which, is not necessarily true, but it's interesting to see how public perception can connect the two of them.
So, okay, so let's keep moving. Let's keep going.
Okay, yeah. Societies have a different prioritization of institutional and interpersonal trust. So some countries actually some have more interpersonal trust, and the US is one of those that has a lot more in the way of interpersonal trust. And there have actually been studies that find, there's studies for everything, apparently, but studies have found that, there was a high degree of trust in institutions. It tended to be more toward Asia. Asia seemed to have more institutional trust. And the US and Europe seem to have more interpersonal trust. And actually, societies that have a high level of institutional trust also have a high level of interpersonal trust. But it does not work the other way. And that would matter here in that, if I wanted to study the difference in trust between the US and China, or the US and India, or...
Here's my question. How would you know that societies that have a high level of institutional trust also have a high level of interpersonal trust?
Well, in this case, they actually did 3 different studies. They did, in some of the, like the social sciences, they're able to do multiple studies in one paper. So you get a really concentrated view of what they were doing. So they used surveys, they used a data set analysis that was based on a large publicly available data set. And then they went, and looked at both of these things and designed a between participant study to check it. So, in this case, they did, some direct surveys, some data set analysis, and some modeling.
Yeah.
And discovered that people who had a high degree of trust in certain institutions like the national government, the police, politicians, that they were more likely to trust strangers, and that was a measure of interpersonal trust. So if you trust the government, you're more likely to trust strangers. And what they gave as the reason for that was that for people who have institutional trust, they believe that the institutions will protect them. And because they believe that the institutions, the fabric of society will protect them, they feel like it is more safe to trust a stranger.
So are they equating trust to safety?
Well, actually, that was one thing that I dealt with in the project, developing the model, was the concept of safety. And I think it is a valid thing to discuss. Safety, patient safety. For pharmaceuticals, it's kind of a no-brainer, but it was a difficult thing to study based on what I was allowed to do. So I think a study that used human participants, it might be possible to look at safety. But here it was not necessary or really possible to look at safety, because it does require, someone to, how would I put this? It kind of requires someone to give their opinion on the safety of a situation. So the number of specific rules that we have about what constitutes safety are difficult to study based on a website or any other or static thing. So you could do study based on the security of a website, but actually that wasn't something we were able to study based on pharmaceutical company websites. There's not there's not an e-commerce situation where you're actually purchasing something off a website where security would be an issue. So it definitely, I think, is part of the discussion, but it was difficult to quantify here.
Okay, fair enough. So keep going. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. So we talked about trust in pharma. It was interesting that Japan actually has a low trust in government institutions, but a high trust in pharma. They have a low trust in the business sector and non-governmental organizations, but they actually think that the high trust in pharma that occurs in Japan is due to physician trust of pharma. So the reps have much more interaction with physicians. They play a much bigger role than reps that typically do here. They actually, have cultural needs that the reps are meeting, and it's interesting to see how that plays into physician trust, which then plays into public trust. But, that is something that I don't really want to get into too deeply here, because I think we could end up with a discussion of, physician pharma trust, which again is another important construct, but really today I'm focusing on the patient.
Okay, so we're now going to the components of trust.
We are. This is the big bit here, the important part. So
hold on, we have a question.
Okay.
Does this not boil down to adhesion contracts? Who has the legal right to be a spokesperson? A CRA cannot speak for the pharmaceutical company. An attorney, medical director, CEO, board of directors have a legal right. Is it all about the contractual language? I can't tell who the typists are, but I'm going to guess this is a lawyer, because not most people other than lawyers don't know about an adhesion contract. I'm not even necessarily sure that a medical director has the legal right to speak for a pharmaceutical company, but maybe I'm trying to read this the other way. How would you respond to this, Angela? Do you see the question?
I do not see the question. Let me see if I can go back in. There we are. All right. So, that is an excellent question, because I'm not specific on obviously CRAs can't speak for pharma. And that is something that also comes up in terms of, patient interaction. So what about the third party customer service company that's dealing with the patient? I'm sure they have very specific things that they can and cannot tell the patient as well. And that's a much lower level issue. But it does feed into the same major issue, which is, who does have the right to be a spokesperson? But then again, you're going to argue, if you, as a member, let's say you work for the pharmaceutical company and you go out and you're having a drink with your friends, is your behavior is going to reflect on the pharmaceutical company based on our previous discussion, which was, if you work for the company at any level, are you speaking for the company? Right. Does the public believe that you are the company? And they might. So it would be kind of an interesting legal discussion, public perception versus what are we legally able to do or allowed to do.
I think at a legal level, it's again, I'm not giving legal advice, but it's who's authorized to speak. So it's not just a adhesion contract, it's who's authorized. So you could very easily say that the attorney is not representative of a pharmaceutical company in a PR role, for example. However, an attorney may very well be representative in the legal capacity. So, or the PR person shouldn't be speaking about the legal role. So I think the context matters. So, yeah. You want to keep going?
Yeah, let's keep going. Unless people are falling asleep, in which case maybe we should stop.
I think you're doing great, actually.
All right. Nobody's asleep yet. Of course, it's a little early, but you never know. All right. So moving on to the components of trust. The first component is benevolence, which in this case refers to the patient perception that the company is behaving in an altruistic manner. Now, I know you and I have gone around and around about this, much discussion. At this point, benevolence, as far as this model is concerned, it is a state of being. So you can communicate benevolence through an activity, but benevolence for the company is the state of being. So it's the idea that, basically it comes down to altruism. Altruism is probably the biggest component of benevolence. And again, benevolence is actually something that occurs in a lot of the the trust-based literature. It's not something new or unusual.
Is that the term that's used? Or is
I'm sorry?
Is that the term that's used, or is that your?
Actually, benevolence is a standard term. Yeah,
Okay.
it comes up a lot. And it's always defined in sort of a similar way. But in this case, I wanted to really discuss the idea of altruism, because that is not necessarily brought up specifically. And in this case, it encompasses the idea that the company can engage in an activity or provide information that is either neutral or harmful to itself to benefit someone else.
So it's saying that this would enhance the amount of trust in the company.
Well, I mean, all of these things are designed to enhance trust. Whether they do or not remains to be seen, right?
Okay.
Okay. So in order to have trust, you must have the patient sort of accept what is being offered. Now, in this definition, and this is important, a benevolent action by a company is limited to a value-added activity. That's very important for this definition. It must be value-added, cannot have a financial benefit for the company whatsoever. Wait, all right, I should rephrase. It cannot have a direct financial benefit.
What if
Yes.
I'm a pharmaceutical company and I decide to sponsor the Girl Scouts?
Okay.
Would that help with trust with patients, or do they have to be? Do the patients have to be helped?
Okay. Well, it kind of depends. I mean, who is your patient population? Are they pediatrics?
Let's assume
Are they
adult population, maybe even a geriatric population.
Okay, so geriatric population, and we are going to sponsor the Girl Scouts. Well, according to this definition, we have to ask ourselves, is there a chance that it will benefit us in some way other than the establishment of trust? Because I think it would be unfair to say that anyone does anything, in terms of a company that is public facing, they're not necessarily going to do anything that, how would I put it, that would negatively affect trust. But they're always trying to positively affect trust. And,
right.
So that may be muddying the waters a little bit here. Okay, let's ask ourselves, does this leverage the patient's pre-existing or potential obligation for direct financial gain? And I would say, in this case, assuming that there is no financial gain to be had from sponsoring the Girl Scouts, we're not expecting that the Girl Scouts are going to suddenly come out and buy our drug. They're going to start asking their doctors for our drug. They're going to be like, give me this drug. I love this drug because we just sponsored the Girl Scouts and I've got to have this drug now.
Yeah.
So that would, in fact, potentially be a benevolent act. So if a patient sees this activity, this pharmaceutical company has sponsored the Girl Scouts, let's say, then they could look at that as being a benevolent act.
So you don't need to have the pharmaceutical company necessarily going and sponsoring, I don't know, the American Diabetes Association, or if they are a diabetes thing, going and sponsoring essentially the groups that might help with financials associated with drug costs. So a patient assistance program, if you will.
Right.
That's not necessary. That you can help in something completely unrelated, and that still helps engender trust, is what you're saying.
It could, yeah, it could.
Okay.
But you'd have to ask yourself, does it make sense?
Okay, explain that.
I mean, it has to be value added. It has to bring value to the patient. So if the patient's not interested in the Girl Scouts, it didn't bring any value to the patient. They may look at it as, oh, well, that was nice, but in this definition, in order to have patient trust, there needs to be value for the patient.
Okay.
Right? Because value added suggests that there must be value, and it must be relevant to the person who's considering the trust state.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So actually, what I use as an example.
So what I hear you saying is,
Mm-hmm.
it may be benevolent,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not value added. So patient assistance program makes sense because it actually generates trust because it adds value to the patient themselves.
Although a patient assistance, it would be benevolence if it were contributing to a patient assistance program that is drug agnostic. So
Right.
there can be no direct benefit, which means if you are, you're offering this program and it happens to be for your drug, and not for company X's drug, then it's not benevolent. You stand to benefit in terms of number of prescriptions. So, that would not be value added. But actually, what would be considered value added is the use of a physician directory on a pharmaceutical website.
Right.
And I know that we have talked about this, and you were kind of surprised that even exists, but it does.
Yeah.
Because again, it could harm. You could argue that the patient gets the doctor's name from your website. The patient goes and sees the doctor prescribes a competitor. So a competitor's drug has been prescribed, and now the company has actually lost the patient. So it has done harm to the company. It's not a great harm, but it's some harm. So there is a risk of harm there, which means it actually would be considered a benevolent act.
Fascinating. Yeah. Okay.
It really is. Yeah. So let's see. Moving on. I looked at this recently, and then I kind of forgot a little bit. So pop quiz. All right. So benevolence. Warmth and approachability. This was a really fascinating study. So it was a study that was actually done, I believe it was, don't quote me on this, I think it was the National Science Academy.
Okay.
It may not have been, I may have remembered incorrectly, but it certainly was a big study that was done through a governmental agency or organization. And what they determined in this study was that people with certain characteristics are believed to be trustworthy.
I'm going to put up a comment, by the way. Here's
Yes.
that just came on.
Okay.
Do you see it? Benevolence, the Almighty doth hinder a pure altruistic goal. Unfortunately, however, not all are greedy. We have good people who apply this worthy principle. Please be noted that practicalities of staying afloat could be a confounder to benevolence.
That is true, and actually I addressed that in a different part of the model, because there are certainly things that benefit the patient and the public perception, and they increase trust, but they also benefit the company, and why not? I mean, if companies were completely altruistic all the time, we would have no economy, right? Because it would be all about altruism, and we would never have, the means to, continue research, pay employees, all that good stuff.
But does that affect the way to get trust then? If it benefits the company? I thought you said earlier on that it shouldn't.
Benevolence shouldn't. But there are other constructs that do, and that's fine. I mean, this is one of many ways in which trust can be engendered. Okay. So, if you don't have benevolence, is there no trust? Actually, that's not true. But benevolence is one way in which patients see.
So this is an either or situation. It's not an and situation.
Well, I mean, it's very complex, but it could be an either or. I mean, it depends on what the individual patient's goals are. Okay. So, if the patient is not interested in an altruistic gesture right now, then benevolence would have no effect on them. Or if the benevolence were out there, but it didn't affect them specifically, like, hey, we just sponsored the Girl Scouts. Well, that's great, but I that's not an organization that I really believe in, or it's not an organization that affects me, or I've never heard of the Girl Scouts.
Yeah.
Then it would have no effect at all.
Fair enough.
All right. So, the warmth and approachability and sympathy of a trust object will increase trust. And actually, there were several studies that supported this, but Fisk or Fiske, I apologize if I have just pronounced the name incorrectly, they actually found that warmth and approachability as measures of benevolence were beneficial when combined with competence. So you have warmth and competence. And what they found was that people in certain industries, as representatives of these industries, were automatically more trustworthy. So the warmest, most competent people were actually doctors, teachers, childcare workers, professors, and nurses.
So not lawyers then?
That was the pinnacle, right? So This was in terms of who should be communicating scientific information to the public.
I think lawyers should be right up there.
Nothing like the warmth and approachability of a lawyer.
Fair enough.
Well, it can be. I mean, it's
Can be, I
unfair
guess.
to say that lawyers are,
I
are
believe
not
these
warm and approachable and competent. But actually, this was an interesting thing. So, in terms of how do patients perceive pharma, I think I'm not absolutely sure because I haven't polled patients to find out. And I really can't within the confines of this study. But the people that you would associate as working in pharma, we've got researchers, we've got scientists, we've got executives, we've got attorneys. All people that you could imagine working in that space. And actually, they were seen as highly competent, but not warm. So it was believed based on the survey responses that actually the people who took the surveys were envious of people who had these jobs. It was very interesting. So they saw them as being envy-provoking, but not warm. So they were not trustworthy. It was very interesting. Highly competent people, not trustworthy.
People who wouldn't interact with the patient. So warmth is also determined based on engagement.
It is possible. And it actually did not discuss that aspect of it. But I certainly think, kind of off the record, that it is true that if you have a face of an actual person, to put with the job description or the industry or the company, that people may be more willing to trust.
Yeah.
Okay. Pharma, unfortunately, is one of those companies where it wouldn't necessarily be prudent to have constant contact with the patients. But, I have some theories about how pharmacy has changed in the last 20 or 30 years and how that is affecting patient trust.
We're probably going to have a different conversation about that eventually.
Yeah, that's different. But I've seen that one personally, how changing the way that pharmacists operate has changed the way that patients perceive them.
Fair enough.
So, but let's not
muddy that up right now.
No, let's not go there. We'll be there all day.
So here's my question. Let's sort of just take Benevolence at this moment, right?
Okay.
So at Benevolence, what we discovered was that there's a whole bunch of factors that go into it. But my question here is our takeaway. We were looking, when we started this conversation several months ago, we were looking at the idea of how can promotional pieces be optimized? Is that where we started from, or what is the topic as we speak right now?
Let's see. The topic in general is how do you promote trust? Right?
Okay, so we're not looking at online anymore. How do you promote trust online is not the question anymore.
Well, it's not necessarily online. It is in this case, how do you communicate trust? How do you communicate? So it could be oral communications, I suppose. It could be written communications. It could be interactive, pieces. It could, generally speaking, though, it could be push through or pull through.
I guess what I'm really asking is, are we talking about, should sales reps be old women who can give you a cookie? Or, because to me, that speaks to warmth and approachability and sympathy. Or does it speak to using warm tones on a website with more pleasing colors as opposed to more aggressive tones?
Well, I don't know. Is it value added? If it's not value added, it's not benevolent. So you can use. Okay.
Yeah.
And actually, there are some other concepts in the model that may better address things like the color or the text. I mean, what if you're colorblind? Now the color matters.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or what if you're visually impaired? Well, now the text matters. Or what if your English is a second language, or your reading level is not very high? Well, now the content matters even more, but it's not benevolent. It's not benevolent to say, I'm going to present this information with wording that you can understand. That actually is not benevolent because it's not value added. It's integral to.
Oh, so there's a distinction.
Right. So value added is also not completely necessary. You could figure out what you need to get a pharmaceutical product without benevolence. Because again, it's value added. It's extra.
Okay.
So it's a bonus. We all like a good bonus. So, for some people, that may be what they need. They may want a perk.
Yeah.
Other people probably don't care.
Okay, let's go to the attunement.
All right, let's go with attunement because we fought about this one, I believe.
Yeah.
Fought is a strong word. We debated heavily about this one. What to call it, how to think about it, how to combine things to get it, all of that good stuff.
Yeah.
So in this model, attunement includes the concepts of awareness, response, and harmony. And actually, the definition of attunement that I'm using here comes from, I believe it's psychology. So it's something that people who work in, like therapy, they would use the term attunement. It's kind of a different construct or a different term from what we're used to using in the life sciences, but I think it fits. Okay. And the more I studied it, the more I think it fits. And again, with this model, it's, if it's relevant and it's recent, it counts.
Okay.
I mean, why not? It's not like we've been doing a great job with what was out there. So let's bring in everything. Let's look at everything again.
Yeah.
So it's a two-way construct. You have to have unity of purpose and alignment of goals of both parties. And that's important because in this model, trust requires two parties. You have the trustor and the trustee. The trustee is pharma, the trustor is the patient. Now, some models of trust, said you don't need two parties. You can have trust with one party. And perhaps sometimes that is true, but again, we're dealing specifically with patients in pharma.
Yeah.
So two-way construct, it results in unity of purpose and alignment of goals, right? So it's kind of an ongoing negotiation, an ongoing dance. So it could encompass a show of benevolence, but it's not benevolence. So that is a little bit tricky. So benevolence is an intrinsic quality of the company that is illustrated through an altruistic action. It does not require a response. It is a thing that is. Right? Attunement must have a response. Must have a response.
Okay.
And that is something that I think we debated a little bit too. So in this case, attunement, again, it has to have a two-way interaction. Does not matter who initiates. If it's successful, it has a non-zero outcome. And that is also important. It actually does not address the notion of harm, except where there is no attunement. Right. So if you don't have a successful interaction, you could affect trust building because there's kind of a breakdown.
Actually, you know what I'm thinking, Angela?
Yes.
I'm thinking we should use attunement as our next conversation.
You think so? We are getting a little bit far afield. I think so too. Perhaps it would make sense to do one of these constructs each week.
Yeah. And then we can dig in deeper each time.
All right. So I'm going to come back up so that nobody looks ahead. So benevolence then.
Okay, so we talked about benevolence. We talked about where we're going. We're gonna eventually start putting this out so that other people can comment on it as well. It's gonna be as far as I know, the first open sourced review of a thesis. So that should be interesting.
That'll be fun.
Oh, hold on. We have another comment.
Okay.
Could we incorporate an evidence-based approach to creating trust? If we could translate technical evidentiary language into a layperson language, we will be creating trust by disclosure of truthful facts. White lies, what's that? Lies are lies, tell the truth. Well, I'm going to ignore the political reference.
Don't be certain people, I guess.
Yeah. But
okay.
What do you think?
That is an interesting idea. But actually, you can't create trust that way.
Tell me why.
Based on the research that I have found, that is not the way to create trust. It makes sense if we think about it, abstractly. Well, if we take this information that is too complex for someone to understand and we break it down and we make it simple, we take a clinical study and we put it in plain language, 5th grade level, everyone can read it, everyone can understand it. Actually, providing information does not increase trust.
What makes you say that?
And this is based on a study where they took, it actually was a utility company. So an institution or the company, it doesn't really matter whether it was the utility company or a specific company. In this case, they gave more information. They thought, if we provide more information about the services that we offer and the value that we provide to the community, maybe people will start to trust us. And it was actually a long-term study. It went for more than a year. And what they discovered was that people's level of trust or distrust was not affected by the amount of information that they received. And as a corollary to that, there's the idea of responsiveness. And I don't believe this directly affects any of the other constructs, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about it. That what was discovered in a study, and again, these are all empirical studies, they all use patient data, and somewhere we should probably post the sources, I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're going to do that in
okay.
future versions.
We'll take care of that. I've got them all in a giant list, so they're there. What they found was that if in communication with a company, you've got the company posting on social media and you've got the patients posting on social media, responding to each other, they actually discovered that if the company was overly responsive, it decreased trust. And that was kind of a mind-blowing moment too. Like, what do you mean being too responsive? It's like patients are creeped out if you're too responsive. In this case, it wasn't specifically patients, it was consumers. But the idea was if the company responded more often than the consumer did, or the same number of times. So let's say that you have 5 posts from the patient and you get 5 back from the company. Now the patient is creeped out, like, leave me alone. Which is really interesting because you think more information is always better. So that isn't necessarily a
But let's
construct.
reanalyze that in the context of benevolence.
Okay.
Wouldn't that be for your benefit? You're being the patient's benefit. And go ahead.
Okay, but we have to remember benevolence is a state of being.
Okay. So
Okay, it's not a communication. Attunement is communication. Benevolence is I am making a gesture. It is up to you whether you would like to accept this gesture, but you don't have to directly interact in order to have benevolence. It is a state of being. So, for example, let's use the example of the patient directory, which a lot of brand websites have now. The directory is out there. You're not required to use it. You can't really communicate with the pharmaceutical company about it. It is sort of independent. It's provided as a service, uses a third party, so it's objective. That would be benevolence, whereas sending the patient an email or a text saying, which doctor do you want to see? Do you want to see this doctor? Do you want to see that doctor? Well, that's not benevolence for a number of reasons. But one of those could be that the communication is not considered benevolence because there's a direct benefit. Okay, now I'm just nitpicking this to death now. But in general, giving people information is not necessarily going to increase trust. And that is a difficult one because it's a very common misconception.
okay. Okay, so we're going to come back to all of these again. Any last word before we hang up on benevolence and talk about this? How was this for you?
Oh, for me?
Yeah.
Okay. No, this was actually really fun. It kind of reminds me of taking the bioethics class.
I'm so sorry.
No, I love the bioethics class. I did. I'm a nerd. Really like philosophy, and yeah, there we are. But no, I think this was a very interesting way to go about dissecting a graduate research paper. And, and I really enjoyed the comments. So thank you to everybody who put in a comment or a question. It's really interesting stuff. And I'm really excited to keep doing it and see what happens.
This was great. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. We'll have this again. I think Angela will be back, next week, and we'll keep continuing. And we'll keep talking. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you.